Hello and welcome to another episode of the American Compass podcast. My name is Drew Holden. I'm the managing editor at American Compass, and I'll be your guest host for this conversation with Mark Halperin. If you're not familiar with Mark, he's the editor-in-chief at Two-Way, which is a new media platform that he launched that provides real-time interactive conversations with guests. I've been on there a number of times. It's a really, really excellent platform, and it's straight down the middle. He's a former media guy. He used to run domestic political coverage at ABC News. He's, I think, a very valuable and very sharp on all things related to media. He's also going to be the forthcoming host of a show called Next Up on the Megyn Kelly network. You may have seen the news. She's expanding the work that she's doing from the Megyn Kelly show to bring in some new voices, some new shows. Mark will be hosting one of those. He and I talk about the current state of the mainstream media, particularly the way that it intersects with and covers President Donald Trump. He and I discuss what the media gets wrong, why that happens, the incentives that exist within journalism that push them away from finding the truth and instead make them partisan advocates against Trump. And we try and make sense of whether or not there's hope for a better future. But before we get to that conversation, I need to tell you about everything we have going on over at Commonplace. We had an excellent piece from Rui Teixeira earlier this week about working class voters and how the Democratic Party has managed to lose them by looking just at the white, college-educated progressive voices, both in terms of the policies that they focus on and the issues that they care about. We also had a really excellent piece from Mike Lind about the free trade absolutists and why they are so emotional when it comes to talking about trade policy. And in case you missed it, be sure you look at our broader symposium on the new tariffs and trade. It's called After Liberation Day, and you can find it on our website, commonplace.org. I can't imagine there's anyone here who has not already subscribed to Oren Substack, but on the off chance you haven't, go to understandingamerica.co and subscribe. He's got new content coming out every Monday and Friday, even on the weeks where he's not able to host the podcast. But with that, enjoy my conversation with Mark Halperin. And Mark Halperin, thanks so much for joining us on the American Compass podcast.
Drew, honored to be here. Thank you for hosting me.
Well, and Mark, also before I forget, I wanted to just congratulate you on your new show on the Megyn Kelly network. That's fantastic news. I mean, I've been a longtime fan, but I know you're launching soon. So,
yeah, I appreciate that. Continue my work on Two-Way, but also adding 2 shows a week under Megyn's umbrella, and super excited about it.
That's fantastic. And, you know, Mark, I think I probably texted you about this, but when I found out that I got to guest host this podcast, I knew I wanted to talk about the media. And I thought to myself, what could I do? What do I need to do to try and compel Mark Halperin to come back on with me? And I asked, and late at night, you got back to me and you were willing to do it. So I thank you for that. But I wanted to talk to you today about a subject that you and I have discussed a lot, which is the American media and particularly how they talk about Donald Trump. So first, I know you're a pro. I know you've been through plenty of administrations, plenty of presidents. One of the things that seems really important to me to kind of frame up is Donald Trump is different. He is a unique president. And so I wonder if I could pick your brain on that. You've seen others. How does he stack up? How does he relate?
Well, he's more sophisticated about the media than any president I've covered. He thinks more about it. He focuses on it. He's a great television producer. If he decided he wanted to not be a developer or a product hawker or a president, he would be fine producing a TV show. And although the press is historically almost always biased against Republicans, there's an animus towards him that's created this cycle that we've seen since 2015 that is unprecedented in my experience, where they're open about their opposition to him. They're incurious about why he has won 2 out of 3 elections. And they adopted a resistance posture, which goes far beyond liberal bias or the normal responsibility of the press to hold every president accountable. For him, the glass is always empty. It's not half full. It's not full.
Yeah.
It's always empty.
Yeah, I think that's a really good way to put it. And the incuriosity point really strikes me as an important one here. There's been, since 2015, 2016, there seems to have been no interest from the media in understanding why so many Americans are attracted to Donald Trump. One of the things that I think you do really well on Two-Way is you invite conversation from your listeners, from real people out in America, to talk about the ways that they feel about the president, and I think also in particular the ways they feel about the media. You know, we're at a moment where the recent polling says the media has their lowest public trust in 5 decades. Does that sound right to you? Does that sound right to what you hear from your guests, from the people you invite on to ask questions?
Yeah, I mean, you hear it from people who supported Trump, some reluctantly, all the time, that the media bias from the Russia investigation through the way his attempt to assassinate him was covered, his agenda, the indictments, the attempts to keep him off the ballot. I hear from people all the time. It's like, literally, the way the media has covered those things is the reason they're voting for Donald Trump, even though there's a lot they don't like. And then I had there was a woman, one of the most seminal moments for me in the history of two-way was when a woman came on who does not like Donald Trump and did not vote for him, said after the election that she understood better why Donald Trump won and was more at peace with it because she'd heard from her fellow community members on the platform that she understood why he won, and she felt comfortable that people who voted for him did so in good faith. The reason I think so many liberals have Trump derangement syndrome and can't understand him is they only hear about Donald Trump through the media that's biased against him, and that keeps them from being the least bit aware of why it is that he's been successful.
Yeah, and I think that's right. You know, I think one of the things that really strikes me is it's not just a couple of outlets, right? It's not like CNN or the New York Times or the Wall Street Journal just has a bone to pick with him. It's en masse across the mainstream media, across everything left of center. There seems to be this unified view of Donald Trump. And one of the big aspects of it that I see, and you know, you and I have talked about a whole bunch, is that means that when they miss, oftentimes when they think that anything Donald Trump could say has to be wrong, cannot possibly be accurate, it is preposterous, you end up with the entire media corps going in the other direction. And so they hold up this example of, well, this is wrong, this is preposterous, this is silly. Here's Donald Trump again, he's sharing misinformation, he's sharing disinformation. And it means that when one of them gets it wrong, and when Trump does happen to get it right, you undercut the trust in the media in such a big, meaningful way, right?
Yeah. I agree with all that. One of the stories I didn't mention, which has caused a backlash against the media, is the cover-up of Joe Biden's loss of mental acuity.
Yeah, that's a great point.
You know, if Donald Trump, walks slowly down a ramp, it's like studying the Zapruder film for people in the dominant media. And there was a 4-year conspiracy to cover up, and I'd argue longer, really, because I think his acuity decline was evident well before 2020 and leading up to 2024. But while he was president, a 4-year conspiracy between the White House and the media, and it's now the case that people who voted for Donald Trump are being asked to say, well, you should still get your media from not just the same organizations, but in many cases the same people. The same reporters. Who spent 4 years trying to beat Donald Trump by pretending they didn't see a mental acuity decline, who allowed themselves to be called and intimidated by the Biden people saying, if you write about this story. And I'll tell you the best example that some real people are familiar with, and if you are familiar with it, you really do have to question fundamentally how the White House gets covered. There's, in the view of the dominant media, a constitutional crisis over the barring of the Associated Press from covering White House events. Okay,
right.
They consider it a constitutional crisis. The exact same thing happened under the Biden administration to the New York Post. The New York Post, the Biden White House didn't like the coverage. They excluded them from events. They did it in a more insidious way because they didn't announce it. They just did it.
Right.
And that story was covered by the New York Post, by you, by me, by a few other people, but blacked out in the dominant media. Even though to the extent the stories the circumstances are identical in almost every particular, what was done to the New York Post is more egregious than what was done to the Associated Press. And so you take an example like that, 4-year cover-up of the loss of mental acuity, the absolutely disparate treatment of two organizations because one's pro-Trump and one's anti-Trump. Yeah. And again, it not just undermines the credibility of the press, but it drives people into the arms of Donald Trump, who otherwise would have a different point of view.
It does. And, I think, to me, one of the things, particularly about the New York Post that's so alarming is, the New York Post famously put out a scoop on Hunter Biden, right? And the White House didn't like it. They said it was disinformation. They rallied a whole bunch of experts to come on and sign this letter saying, oh, it's Russian disinformation. It has all the classic trademarks of Russian intelligence. And they promoted the story out, and it was wrong. It was deceptive, and it was a deliberate lie. And so instead of, one, even attempting to confront that reality, two, rather than show any interest in trying to get at any of this information, or three, even just ignoring it from the Post, not only did they try to brush it off with these other criticisms, they blackballed the Post, as you talked about, and one of the most insidious points, I think, they worked with social media companies to prevent that story from going anywhere. The New York Post was kicked off then Twitter, now X, for years as a result of this. Yeah. They were shadow banned for years.
Yeah. And Drew had one other not inconsequential element. It might have determined who won the election.
Yeah, and that gets me to I think another point that I really want to talk about with you is people say, every so often, I'm sure you get this from some, on occasion when you talk about the media. Talk about the media a lot, and people will say, well, who cares? It's not the substance of the thing. Why do we care so much about what these people are reporting? It doesn't really matter, yada, yada, yada. I think you just articulated it perfectly. There are many cases, the Hunter Biden laptop story absolutely being one of them, where these sorts of issues intersect really directly with world events and elections. So can you take us through why this story was so fundamental to the 2020 election?
The Hunter Biden story?
Yeah, the Hunter Biden story.
Well, I mean, Joe Biden didn't win by very much. And you can't say scientifically that if the story had been covered fairly, that Trump would have won. But we can't say it's not the case. That it was pretty significant information. And of course, I know you know well, the full Hunter Biden story has never been covered by anyone, right? And saw a few weeks ago the release of email exchanges between the then ambassador to Italy and Hunter Biden, with Hunter Biden asking for the Obama administration's help with his business dealings. Yeah. Amazing that was never released previously. What else hasn't been released? But the point is, I think there's three fundamental reasons why this matters. Number one, it might have affected the outcome of the election, and that's, of course, outrageous that such a thing would occur on either side. Second, it undermines confidence in the press. Yes. To be trusted as an important institution in a free society. And third, it creates this asymmetry that is a constant drumbeat of the right. When Donald Trump, Pete Hegg said now, he deserves more scrutiny than he's getting. I'm not saying he should quit or be fired, but he deserves more scrutiny. But the problem is, half the country's not the least bit interested in any scrutiny because the other tribe has said he should go, and they say, well, it's fake news. So you have this imbalance now. But one side is covered unfairly, and therefore you can't have an honest, democratic debate, free debate, because the tribes just line up no matter what happens.
Yeah, exactly. And I think, to me, it ends up meaning that a relatively liberal press corps ends up operating in a way that's incredibly self-defeating, right? Yeah. There's nothing they could do. And particularly during Trump's second term, when he is the guy with the nuclear codes, when he's the guy in the White House, when the media should be, I think in a lot of cases, having a field day with some of the maybe not quite above board things that the administration is doing. And so by burning all of their trust with voters, particularly voters who are supportive of the president, they can't actually hold the organization to account. They can't operate as a free and fair press that seeks to kind of redress all of these consequences and these issues. I mean,
I agree.
Do you think?
I agree.
And so it seems so counterintuitive.
It's also
and one of the ways. Go ahead.
Just to say, it's also a shocking abrogation of professional responsibility. Yeah. I don't know if a doctor did something so far in conflict with what their job is supposed to be. I don't know what that would mean. A professional athlete, a singer, a teacher. I mean, this is an outrage and no acknowledgement. Go read the New York Times, the Washington Post, and try to find any discussion on how they covered Joe Biden's mental acuity. They're just trying to wipe it from the history books, and the lack of credibility that exists there. I really don't know what my colleagues think about it because they're so reluctant to even admit it happened. But you just think about how you're operating as if it never occurred and as if half the country didn't see it and wasn't outraged by it. I find it tragic.
And you see, unfortunately, so many of these voices, Jake Tapper obviously being, I think, probably the biggest one of these, you see so many people now running out to write their tell-all books about what happened, right? All of these secrets, what were then secrets, rather than be front-page headline reports, they're going into these books. And, I think to your point, one of the things about all of this is that really just blows my mind about the Biden coverage is that it wasn't simply press inaction. It wasn't just that they weren't talking about this thing. It wasn't just that, they were trying to be a little bit more cautious about how they talked about the president or anything like that. They actively downplayed critics. They actively tried to bury the Her report back in February, in February of 2022, 2023, that came out and said, hey, there's actually something here, right? We should probably talk about this. We have a president whose mental capacity may not be what it once was. Don't you think that's important when it's the guy who has the nuclear codes? And instead, the media's coverage to a fault was, look at Republicans pointing at these conspiracies, right? It was the cheap fakes that were dotting social media and how social media companies needed to do more to stamp out these cheap fakes, which again, a dereliction of duty, I think, is a really, really good way to put it, because it is their job to do better.
Yeah. And in the parallels, Hunter Biden's story, a normal press corps would have been insatiably curious and wouldn't have constantly moved the goalposts, right? The goalpost for Hunter Biden first was, did Joe Biden know about his son's business meetings? Well, that was patently absurd to say he didn't. For one thing, he flew Hunter on Air Force Two to business meetings. You think they didn't get back on the plane and discuss it? Then as there was documentation of meetings, photos, etc., said, well, he didn't benefit directly. And then, basically it got down to, there was no suitcases full of cash being photographed, being handed to him with, Chinese currency. I think that the House Republicans did a disservice to America by doing such a horrible job running the investigation into Hunter Biden and Joe Biden. They made it easier for the press to say this is all not on the up and up. But it's the same with the mental acuity story. Rather than being curious about holding powerful interests accountable and assigning their top investigative reporters, they largely assigned political reporters, and every story had to say, no evidence Joe Biden benefited directly. Every story had to say, Biden's, Democrats say his mental acuity is fine. I would never in my career quote a Biden official saying, oh, he runs circles around us. Like, no, he wasn't running circles around us. So those two stories are historic examples. They are representative of, I think, amongst the greatest scandals in American media history. But then there's 1,000 other examples. And although you often feel lonely on the media beat, are you writing for 100 people? No. I know from two-way, real people understand it. They see it. It's embarrassing to them to live in a country where the president's loss of mental acuity does not require investigative reporting. It requires a C-SPAN subscription. And they're embarrassed to see a press corps pretend it's not happening.
Yeah, and I think, Mark, that makes you perfectly equipped to handle the next question, which is, why doesn't the media course correct? Why hasn't this been fixed? Why is it because their audience doesn't care? Is it because their funders don't care? I am miffed, constantly miffed, and I think on the right sometimes we get a little bit into kind of the dark theoreticals about, well, what's really driving this? And I try and be a little bit more charitable. And so particularly as someone who's been in mainstream media, why is it that that message isn't getting through to the journalists and the editors and the reporters?
Yeah, it's a complicated question, and a super important one for the people like us who want this fixed.
Yeah.
Number one, they're just culturally liberal. Now, why does the media attract cultural liberals, and why does it perpetuate itself? I don't know. I don't know completely, but they're cultural liberals, and I've seen that from the beginning of my career. They live in a world where people are liberal on not every issue, but on most issues. Number two, they have Trump derangement syndrome, and they've just decided that part of their professional obligation is to hurt Donald Trump's chances of success. Number three, a reason it doesn't correct is there's a ton of cognitive dissonance. You see people in the media go out and say, I don't see liberal bias. I've never seen liberal bias. And I've worked at NBC News for 20 years. I've never seen liberal bias. No, I mean, you're willfully pretending something doesn't exist and obviously exists. And to if you were running NBC News, the Washington Post, and you were to do, even if you didn't make it public, just a full accounting to your employees, it would be an acknowledgement of not just error, but of corruption, of core responsibility so profound that it'd be quite an unusual step to take. And I just think these places don't want their liberal employees to revolt, and they don't want to have, even if they try to keep it private, they don't want to be open about acknowledging just how outrageous the conduct has been for decades, but particularly bad, as we've said, with Donald Trump in the White House.
And I guess I wonder if that's one of the problems, right? Is that there's really no way to reveal and reckon with this reality without going back a lot further than Donald Trump, right?
Yeah.
You're going to have to get to the Mitt Romney putting his dog on the top of his car on a family vacation conversation, right? And I think that's really uncomfortable for a lot of people, particularly maybe people who were cub reporters back then who are now running some of these organizations or at least senior in these organizations.
Yeah.
But it makes me wonder, if not now, if not with the Trump moment, when? When is there the media corrective? Will there be a media corrective?
I mean, it's hard to say because there's another reason why the bias exists, which is the business models of these places is predicated on not alienating the left.
Yep.
And that's true. It's certainly true of MSNBC. It's certainly true of the Daily Beast, but it's also true of NBC News, right? They're reliant on not offending those folks. And so it's not just a kind of a come to Jesus editorial decision that would require a lot of courage to acknowledge. It's not just a risk that your employees won't like it, but you're risking alienating your primary customers.
Yeah.
And so part of why I'm proud of Two-Way and part of why I hope we succeed is because there have to be business models that allow people in the business of telling the truth to actually tell the truth.
Yeah.
And if you can't tell the truth because you're afraid your business will go out of business, that's a tough place for a journalist to be in.
Yeah, I think that's right. And I fear so many journalists are in that boat, particularly with, media outlets not making a lot of money. And so what the other big subject I wanted to talk to you a little bit about, because I haven't made sense of it myself, is the rush for clicks and the demand for clicks and the demand of advertising dollars. And it strikes me that one of the big problems with the way the media operates, particularly when it comes to repeating stories that may eventually not be true, is that one, there's really no corrective for them. But two, and maybe even more harmfully, is that a lot of outlets are incentivized to be the first ones to break a story, to be the first ones to tweet out a story, to be the first ones to kind of be on this beat. And so maybe it doesn't pass muster, maybe it's questionable, but all the incentives align with, let's get it out there. If we have to retract, no one's going to look at the retraction. We'll put that out there and it'll be fine. The people who don't like us won't like us, but maybe we get this big scoop. Do you think that's fair? I also worry sometimes I get too much into my media critic hat, not as a right and forward critic, but as a hatchet man sometimes. And so am I being too hatchety in this, or do you think that's accurate?
Well, it's accurate for a place like the Daily Beast.
Sure.
It's more complicated when you say the Washington Post or the New York Times. They hear me calling them liberally biased all the time.
Sure.
And they never call and complain. I shouldn't say never. They rarely call and complain. but they are in denial about their business model. And they would say, well, our coverage is fair. And, that we're not doing it to go for clicks. We're trying to be responsible and do quality work.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I'll give you one example I give all the time to my friends at the Washington Post when they say, what's wrong with our coverage? They have these two gentlemen who write not in the opinion pages, but write in the news pages.
Which I think is a meaningful distinction, right?
Yeah,
so many of these outlets.
Yeah. They're placed in the news sections of their political coverage. And they are virulently anti-Trump. Right? All they do is write pieces that are negative about Trump and tendentiously so in many cases. And so they don't have comparable people, writing negative pieces about Democrats. And yet I've never had anyone at the Post raise that to me to say, here's the thing that's probably a problem if we want conservatives to think our coverage is fair. I don't understand how Jeff Bezos hasn't fixed that, given what he's done on the editorial page. And the problem is that what I'm saying is that those places, in some ways, it's even more insidious because they're not acknowledging that they're left wing. They I don't think they think their business model is to be left wing as explicitly as from other places. They act as if it is.
Right. And, I remember back in 2016, there was this great effort from the New York Times or from other outlets to say, we need to bring in more voices. We need more young conservatives. They got Barry Weiss at the New York Times for a brief period of time before they ran her out of town. But the entire industry's attempt at correcting this was for a couple of leading outlets to bring in just a couple of people who might be a little bit right of center. And you saw the way that these outlets leading into Donald Trump's term and then 2019 and 2020 and the pandemic and everything else, you saw how virulently these newsrooms reacted to even a single or maybe even just a couple of conservatives. Is it really possible to think that these places are capable of the intellectual diversity that it would require to achieve some of these changes?
Well, I think the fact that there have been some changes and having caused an absolute mass resignation means it's possible. I don't really want a world where there's liberal journalists and conservative journalists. I want a world where there are old-fashioned journalists who are actually fair to everybody. So I'm not super in love with the corrective of bringing in one or two people. And as you correctly suggested, even if they do, it's insufficient.
Yeah.
I think they need to think more from the ground up of who's already there, who can actually be fair, and who can they hire who can be fair. That's the way to fix it, to my mind, rather than having, some unfair people on one side and some unfair people on the other.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that sounds right to me. And it strikes me that that's probably what the American people want. I think as I mentioned earlier, you've brought me on the two-way a whole bunch. And I really valued and appreciated being able to hear those sorts of questions. And it does seem that at the end of the day, the questions, even if they're political, even if they're what we might conventionally see as partisan, they're not looking for partisan answers, right? They're looking for straight answers. And the role of the media historically has been that kind of Walter Cronkite, straight down the middle. Here are the facts. You can trust them. Because it's on the New York Times letterhead, you could trust it. I think that's still what people want. I don't think people, you see a lot of people driven to click on some of these more politically infused sort of coverages, but I don't actually think fundamentally that that's what people are looking for when it comes to the media they consume.
Well, I think there's some people who would like to stay in a red or blue bubble, some people. But I think the most underserved people are the people who want the facts. And I think it extends, as your question implies this. People sometimes say, well, two ways for moderate centrists and independents. And I say, no, it's for them, but we want people on the far left, the far right too, because we want people to hear each other. Yeah. So people who want to understand the Trump phenomena, but don't agree with the MAGA movement, I'd say there's tens of millions who say, yeah, give me the facts. Don't give me pro-MAGA. Don't give me anti-MAGA. Give me facts. And it may not be a majority, but it's certainly a plurality, and it's certainly the tens of millions of people who are underserved as news consumers.
Yeah, that sounds right to me. So, Mark, I know you're a little bit time boxed, so I want to make sure I ask my final question.
Yeah.
I'm not particularly inspired to think that this answer is going to be a resounding yes, but what do you think are the odds that the media corrects? What do you think are the odds that it gets better? I think it's so harmful and damaging as a country if people don't trust that there is a free and fair and open press. Do you think at some time in the near future that there's gonna be the scales falling from some eyes, that there's gonna be people who wake up to this reality that the industry course corrects, even if just a little?
I'm 90% sure it will get at least 10% better. But 10%'s not very much. I'm not very optimistic it will get so much better that it will put you out of business. I think it will get. I think that like a lot of things in politics and in media, we're gonna have to wait to see what the post Donald Trump world is like. Yeah. And we're gonna have to see what the business models are like. If places continue to believe that their economic survival depends on being biased against conservatives, they'll continue to do that, unfortunately. Okay. But I think if there's creativity and a belief that it's not only the right thing to do morally and professionally, but the right thing to do to make the buck, then I think the odds of pretty fundamental change go up. But I don't see that yet. I see in places like Two Way and other new media places, I see efforts to not just fill the void, but to set an example. But if you're talking about the legacy places that still have giant reach, there's so much they'd have to do to fix it. And so much of it to be a risk to their business model. I'm skeptical, unfortunately.
Well, unfortunately, I happen to agree. I want to hold out some optimism. I am a notoriously optimistic person, so I will take from that the shred of optimism that you provided.
There's a chance. There's a chance.
Always a chance. Well, Mark, I can't thank you enough for making the time to come on and talk with me. I know you're a very busy guy, so thank you, truly from the bottom of my heart.
Drew, honored to be included. Always love talking to you and appreciate the chance to come visit with your folks. So thank you so much.
Fantastic. And we will be back again soon with another episode of the American Compass Podcast.